Why don't you come aboard my boat for a nice, pleasant cruise? Hey everybody, welcome back, and it is a Patreon sponsored review because yes, if you wish, you can hop on over to the Patreon and there is a tier where you can actually get me to review specific things, including books, and that has happened. I got commissioned to review a book by George R.R. Martin, and it's none of the books in the Song of Ice and Fire series. Instead, it's a book as old as I am, set in the pre-Civil War South, about vampires on a steamboat. It's called Fevre Dream. Now, I've never read George R.R. Martin before reading this book. So, my entire experience with him was basically through Game of Thrones, the show. And I sort of taking into account that, at least as people who have been reading the books have been telling me, is that the first few seasons, basically through season 4, felt very much like his writing, whereas after that it drifted off a little bit. So, my ability to say it's true to Martin's writing is a little bit hampered by the fact that I haven't read a ton of it. But I'll tell you what, reading this book, all the things that people have told me about Martin's writing, from people who've read Game of Thrones books, I'm like, yeah, that all rings really true. I was quite impressed with this thing. So, where do we begin? Okay, so at the end of the day, this actually has a pretty confined narrative. It spans a number of years, strictly speaking, but it's not being told continuously. There's a couple of time jumps involved. And it's ultimately just a story about primarily one steamboat called the Fevre Dream and its captain, a man named Abner Marsh, who basically is kind of like if Davos Seaworth from Game of Thrones ran a steamboat. It's funny because this book predates any of the Game of Thrones books. And there's a number of characters that I can't help but feel like this is almost like a prototype version of that character over in Game of Thrones, weren't they? And I feel like Abner Marsh has some of the seeds of Davos Seaworth in him. He's rough. He's rough and tumble. He's crass, but he's honorable. He has a strong sense of duty and morality, even though he's not blind to the realities of the time and place where he lives and his position in that world. So you've got all that going on. And there is one other POV character, a rather nasty character by the name of Sour Billy Tipton. And they're the only two POV characters we get. And the book does something that I tend to like, which is the protagonists are not really the most important people in the story. And what I mean by that is, if you were to sit down and sketch out the struggle being had, the story being told, what's going on, the conflicts happening, and why it's important, Abner Marsh would be a footnote. And Sour Billy Tipton probably wouldn't even get a look in, because they are adjacent to and connected to much bigger, more important people. But they are the ones who get to tell the story. Not direct first person, but they're the ones whose view we are getting everything through. And that is an approach I like. I mean, it's one of the reasons that I like the movie The 13th Warrior. So I appreciate that. Martin's great at evoking character through both description and through dialogue. All of the characters in this have incredibly distinct voices. You have Abner Marsh, who is, his entire adult life, he's been a riverboat man. That's who he is. That's what he does. You've got a number of, the people who work under him with names like Harry Mike. And his pilots that help him with the ship. You have his business partner, the somewhat mysterious Joshua York, who's got a very refined voice. You've got the smooth but deadly sense that you get off. There's a character by the name of Damon Julian, and he's like, okay. I'm really uncomfortable when you're in the room. And that just comes across in the way that they're described and the way that they speak. And Sour Billy's just deplorable. That's just what he is. And there's more characters than that besides. But everybody has... This is a story of very strong personalities. And I really appreciated that. And... the other thing that's worth noting about how old this is, being from 1982, there are a number of things in it that I'm like, was he the first one to think of that? Particularly in regards to vampire lore. So, I had first heard the idea of Cain from the biblical story of Cain and Abel effectively being the first vampire, or the origin of vampires, from Vampire the Masquerade, from the White Wolf role-playing game source books, which was about 91-ish that happened. This book, 1982, suggested that first. So I'm like, oh, okay, so this predates that thing that I thought White Wolf made up and I always thought was a neat idea. Okay, cool. And while this was written after, say, Interview with the Vampire, which, was kind of the first major successful work that started to really tinker with vampire lore and really start to look at vampires as characters more than just as monsters. It does sort of take things to the next level in a lot of ways from sort of what Anne Rice had done in that area, because we get different sides of the coin with someone like Joshua York, who is, wants as much as possible to live and dwell in the human world and to be part of it. Whereas you also have Damon Julian, who he couldn't care less. He does not even think of human beings as people. They are cattle to him. That is all they ever will be. And he'll move about in their world, but he doesn't care at all. And it's the humans to him are just resources to be tapped, and anything they build or create is just something for him to take or leave. And seeing the depth of character given to them is something that, if this was written for the first time now, I'd think, yeah, okay. But just knowing how long ago he wrote this, and like, dang, I don't know how well the book did when it came out. I can't imagine it was a massive splash, because I'd never heard of it before this. But I'm surprised it doesn't come up more often in terms of like major influences on the direction that vampires in fiction have taken. And the only reason that I can think of off the top of my head is that it didn't sell well enough to be a major influence. But there's a lot of concepts that are pretty standard now in terms of the nature of vampires and the approach to their characterization. That was pretty new for 1982. And that rhymed, and I'm really embarrassed by that. But I was quite impressed with this. If I was going to make one particular criticism, and it is a very particular one, As I said, this is set about 85% of it, timeline-wise, is in the pre-Civil War South. So there is a language used that I will not repeat on camera. I think you know what I'm saying. Where I was okay reading it in dialogue. However, it was a word that also just showed up as a descriptor, like in narrative. Not that a character said it, but like the narration says it. And that like made me real uncomfortable. Like, I suppose the justification is the narrative is always still through the perspective of either Abner Marsh or Sour Billy Tipton. And they, especially Sour Billy, actually would think in those terms. So I'm not going to say there's no narrative justification for it, but I will say that threw me off. As someone who was prepared to give a pass to the use of the word in dialogue, given the time and the setting. So that threw me off a little bit. I know that Martin can get criticized for abuse of female characters, basically. There isn't a ton of that. There is some. But again, a lot of it has to do with sort of is within the context of kind of what you expect out of a vampire story. Vampires like young, nubile prey. So, yeah. That said, for how much, given the premise, how much more of that there could have been, not nearly as much as I kind of was afraid was going to be in there. So that was actually a mild relief. But it is there. So if that kind of depictions, sexual violence, if that's an issue for you, again, it's not pervasive across the book, but it is in there. So you'd want to be aware of that. The thing is, I haven't really talked about the plot. Because the plot ultimately is surprisingly straightforward. In terms of Marsh hooks up with a rich guy, that's Joshua York, who offers to finance him building a brand new, massive, fast steamboat. And we eventually learn over time more about Joshua and who he is and what he's doing. And then eventually they come into conflict with Damon Julian. And it's not a massive twisty-turny story, except it also kind of is, because it kept building to moments that I thought I knew what was going to happen, and then it pivoted ever so slightly for things to go in a slightly different direction for that. Not like a massive, we yanked the rug out from under you, but just a little like, oh, no, not that way. Here, that way. Yeah. So it's just little nudges in terms of the directions of the story and where it goes. And the other thing is, for being a fairly straightforward and ultimately relatively small story, just about a handful of characters, and ultimately about Abner Marsh more than anybody else, it feels much bigger. Because of stuff that you can kind of get away with in a novel that doesn't work as well in TV, and I feel really doesn't work on film, which is that even though the narrative is this pretty restricted period of time, you can have a chapter or two that is just Joshua York telling his own personal history to Marsh and to us, the audience, and suddenly we get this whole back end of the story filled in. And, we learn more about Damon Julian, and we get this whole other area filled in. And it makes the whole thing feel bigger in scope, but by keeping it restricted to Marsh, it manages to feel way more personal than the story on paper would be, or at least than I would expect it to be. I was quite impressed with this, and I definitely get why Martin's writing inspires the kind of loyalty that has people waiting for years on end for his next book. Yeah. The craft of the writing is just really good. It gives you just enough detail to be really evocative of very specific times and feelings and atmospheres, while never getting bogged down, and it keeps a really good pace. The Fevre Dream. Yeah. I didn't know about this, but if you like George R.R. Martin's writing, and or if you like vampire stories, and you haven't read this thing yet, check it out. I've been doing pretty well with the books I've gotten commissioned for, which is good because they take more time. But yeah. Thank you for commissioning that one. I dug it. Fevre Dream. Have you read it? What'd you think about it? If not, what is your favorite vampire story? So let's leave movies and TV aside. So what's your favorite vampire novel or story? For me, it's Blood-Sucking Fiends, a Love Story by Christopher Moore. I think that still takes top. I haven't reread it in a while. But this was dang good. What is it for you? Or if you have read this book, what do you think of it? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Then there's all the usual stuff to do. Like, subscribe, comment, Patreon support. Hey! It'd be appreciated. There's links to all the stuff that you would need to do so down in the description, but you also don't have to. Because at the end of the day, you're the council. I just run the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. Talking with these things is annoying.